The old man set the shotgun down on the glass counter with both hands, steady as a carpenter laying the last stone of a foundation he'd been planning for years. The pawnshop owner barely glanced up from the register. "I'll give you $20 for it," he said. He looked up then, took in the cane hooked over the counter's edge, the worn wool coat, the 80 years written into the man's face, and revised his offer downward without changing his expression. "Actually, I've got no room. It's not worth the shelf space." "It isn't mine to sell," the old man said quietly. "I want to buy it." The owner turned the rusted shotgun over in his hands once, like a man examining a broken appliance he's already decided to throw away. "Sir, this is a wall hanger at best. $180, and I'm being generous with that number." The old man reached into his coat, set 4 $50 bills on the glass counter, picked up the Winchester, walked out. By Friday, a collector would be sitting in that parking lot offering $12,000 for what the owner had called junk. If you believe that every person who walks through a door deserves to be taken seriously, type honor in the comments right now. His name was Walter Puit, and he was 81 years old, which meant very little to him personally, and apparently even less to the people who looked at him. He was not a small man exactly. Once he had been something other than small, and traces of that remained in the width of his shoulders, in the particular way he moved through a room, with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who had learned long ago that the only speed worth moving at was the one that let you see everything clearly. The cane was a relatively recent addition, 18 months old, the result of a hip that had finally lost the argument it had been quietly losing since the winter of 1950, when a fragment of Chinese mortar had lodged itself 2 inches below his iliac crest on a ridgeline above the Chosin Reservoir and decided to stay for the next 7 decades. He didn't complain about the hip. He didn't complain about much. He had adopted the cane with the same unceremonious practicality he brought to everything that required adapting to, which was a long list, and one he had never once found it useful to resent. His hands were the most remarkable thing about him, and almost nobody noticed them anymore, because most people who looked at Walter Puit saw only the cane and the coat and the age. But those hands, large, still possessed of a remarkable stillness, the knuckles shaped by 50 years of precision work, the kind of hands that understood spring tension the way a musician understands pitch. He had run a small gunsmithing shop out of the garage of his father's house in Millard County for 31 years after leaving the army, and those hands remembered everything they had ever been taught, every firing pin they had polished back to tolerance, every barrel they had crowned, every action they had freed from the long sleep of rust and neglect. The work was slow, and it was exact, and it asked everything of you. And Walter had always considered that a reasonable arrangement. He lived alone in his father's house, the one Arthur Puit had built in 1929 from lumber. He had milled himself on land he'd worked since before the First War changed. The meaning of the word work for men of his generation. Walter drove a 1988 GMC pickup that he maintained himself down to the last gasket and filter, because that was how Arthur had taught him to treat machinery, and he saw no compelling reason to deviate from that instruction at 81. On the mantelpiece in the sitting room, between a small American flag that had been his father's and a bronze pheasant his wife Margaret had liked enough to keep for 40 years, there was a photograph in a plain wooden frame, a young man in a doughboy's uniform, canvas leggings laced to the knee, a broad-brimmed campaign hat pushed back on his head, as if he'd just come in from somewhere and hadn't quite gotten around to removing it. He was squinting into the light of a country that was not Kansas. The tree line behind him was wrong for Kansas, the quality of the light was wrong, and he was holding a pump-action shotgun loosely at his side, one hand on the pistol grip, casual as a man carrying a walking stick, except for the particular set of his jaw and the particular angle of his shoulders that told a different story to anyone who knew how to read it. His name had been Arthur William Puit. He had carried that shotgun through the last weeks of the Meuse-Argonne offensive in the autumn of 1918. He had come home from France in February of 1919 with a knee that complained in cold weather, a Purple Heart he kept in a drawer and never once displayed, and a silence about what had happened over there that was so complete and so consistent that Walter had grown up understanding it as simply one of the facts of his father, like the colour of his eyes. Arthur had broken that silence exactly once. It was the detail that had been driving Walter Puit for 47 years, and on the morning he drove 40 minutes to a pawnshop on Tanner Street with a blurry photograph on his phone from a listing he'd found the previous evening, It was the detail he was thinking about when he put the truck in park and sat in the lot for 3 minutes before going inside. Conklin's Pawn and Resale occupied a storefront on the far end of Tanner Street, between a muffler shop and an insurance office, in a building that had been a hardware store, then a used bookshop, then a vacuum repair place before Darren Conklin had signed the lease in 2009 and decided to try his hand at the resale trade. He was 46, broad-shouldered, and had been doing this long enough to have developed the particular brand of professional skepticism that comes from 17 years of people walking through your door absolutely certain that their grandmother's lamp was worth $400. He was not a cruel man. He was a busy man, a financially pressured man, a man whose landlord had raised the rent 2 months ago, and whose most reliable employee had just given notice, and he had learned, out of the simple self-preservation instinct that sustains small business owners, not to get excited about things until he had a concrete reason to get excited. The Winchester had come in 4 weeks earlier as part of an estate lot from out in Henderson, a corrugated cardboard box of miscellaneous firearms and accessories that Darren had purchased sight unseen for $400 at an estate sale, which was the kind of transaction he both loved and dreaded in equal measure, because it could go either way. He had unpacked the box on a Thursday afternoon. Most of it was exactly what he'd expected. 2 old .22 rifles with cracked stocks, a broken-down Ithaca pump that would cost more to fix than it was worth, a lidded tin of loose brass in mixed calibers, a handful of cleaning rods. The Winchester had been at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a square of burlap sacking that had fused itself to part of the metal from what appeared to be decades of contact with moisture. He had unwrapped it, worked the action with some effort, noted the extensive surface oxidation across the receiver, barrel and magazine tube, confirmed that the mechanism would cycle if you forced it, but wouldn't cycle freely, and priced it at $180 as a display piece. He tagged it as is, display only, hung it on the long gun rack behind the main counter, and had not looked at it particularly closely since. His 23-year-old employee, Tyler Marsh, was at the counter when Walter pushed through the door on a Tuesday morning, leaning back against the jewellery case in the way he leaned against things when business was slow, which was most Tuesday mornings, idly watching the door with the practised incuriosity of someone who has categorised most of the people who come through it before they finish walking in. He looked at the old man, cane, wool coat, moving at a deliberate pace, and looked back at his phone. Walter paused just inside the threshold for a moment, the way he always paused when entering a new space, and took the room in from one side to the other with those pale blue eyes. Then he walked to the counter and, in a voice that was courteous and unhurried, asked to see the shotgun hanging in the rack. There was a woman browsing the jewellery cases, mid-50s, reading glasses pushed up on her head, taking her time. A heavy-set man working through the amplifiers along the right wall. Nobody else. Not one of them was paying any attention to the old man at the counter. Tyler pulled the Winchester down from the rack and set it on the glass with the mild carelessness of someone handling something he already knows the value of. Walter put on his reading glasses. He leaned forward on the cane, and he tilted the receiver toward the fluorescent light overhead. He went very still. "May I?" he said, and reached into his breast pocket without waiting for an answer. He withdrew a small square of oil-treated chamois, the kind that doesn't come from a plastic sleeve at a sporting goods store, the kind a working craftsman keeps folded in a pocket for a specific purpose, and placed it carefully beneath the receiver. Then, with the edge of his thumbnail methodically and without any particular hurry, he began clearing a small patch of oxidation from the metal just forward of the action, on the left side of the receiver. Tyler watched with the mild curiosity of someone who has nothing better to do. "Sir," Darren said, appearing from the back room, drying his hands on a shop rag. His voice had the pleasant, authoritative tone of a man who has redirected hundreds of over-enthusiastic customers. "I appreciate the interest, but I can't have customers handling—" "There's a flaming bomb stamp here," Walter said. He wasn't addressing Darren specifically. He was simply reporting what he saw, the way a man reading a map out loud might say the name of a road. Darren stopped, drying his hands. "A what?" "Army Ordnance Acceptance Stamp. A flaming bomb over a broad arrow. This is a military gun." Darren came around the counter, took the Winchester from the glass, and squinted at the spot Walter had indicated. He could see something there, a faint impression in the metal, a design of some kind under the remaining oxidation. Could be a tool mark, could be a factory proof, could be anything. He set the gun back on the counter. He looked at Walter with the particular expression, carefully neutral, gently firm, that he used with elderly customers who had arrived at a conclusion the evidence did not support. "Sir," he said, "I've assessed this piece myself. It's a standard commercial model, probably manufactured somewhere in the teens or 20s, and the action is frozen. At $180, I'm actually giving you the benefit of the doubt here." "Who else looked at it?" Walter asked. "I assessed it myself," Darren said, a half-beat slower. Walter nodded once. He did not argue. He did not explain. He reached into the inside pocket of the wool coat and withdrew a slim leather billfold so old the leather had gone the colour of dark tea, and he extracted 4 $50 bills and placed them on the counter in a neat row, one next to the other, with the deliberate precision of a man who has made a decision and completed it. "I'll take it," he said. Darren looked at the bills. He looked at the old man. "Sir?" There was something almost pained in his voice now, the sound of a man who has convinced himself he's doing someone a service by talking them out of a purchase. "I'm being honest with you because I think you deserve honesty. You're going to spend $200 on a gun, and then you're going to need parts for a gun this old, which are not going to be cheap or easy to find, and at the end of that process you're going to have something you still can't safely shoot. That's the reality here." Tyler had drifted over from the jewellery case and was standing with his arms folded, watching. He had the expression of a man who has already arrived at the conclusion and is simply waiting for the scene to finish. Walter Pruitt looked at Darren Conklin for a long moment. His face was not angry. It was not hurt. It was the face of a man who has been told what he cannot or should not do a sufficient number of times in his life, to have developed a certain philosophical equanimity about the experience, and who has spent the better part of 80 years demonstrating quietly and without announcement that he understood the situation better than the people explaining it to him. "That's very considerate," he said. He didn't move his hand from the bills. The woman who'd been browsing the jewellery case had drifted closer during the exchange. Not intrusively, just by degrees, in the way that people drift towards something they can't quite categorise. She was watching from a discreet distance with the quiet attention of someone who has heard this particular rhythm before and knows what it sounds like. Darren exhaled. He picked up the money. Tyler rang the transaction through without comment and reached under the counter for a long cardboard box that had once held a fluorescent light tube. "I don't need the box," Walter said. Tyler shrugged and handed the gun across the glass. Walter received it in both hands, turned it once with the easy authority of a long habit, a single, practised motion that was not showy but was unmistakably fluent, and tucked it under his arm. "Have a good day," he said to Darren, and he meant it without irony. He walked to the door. The bell above it rang once, and he was gone. The woman by the jewellery case watched the door close behind him. She looked at Darren. She didn't say anything. She went back to the rings. Darren stood at the register for a moment after the door had shut. He couldn't have said precisely what the feeling was. Not guilt exactly, not yet. More like the low-grade discomfort of a man who has misread a room and knows it but can't identify how. He would think about the exchange on and off for the rest of the day, and would not be able to explain why it stayed with him. He wouldn't understand why until the following Saturday afternoon, when a silver Lexus pulled into his parking lot, and a man he had never seen before walked in carrying a leather portfolio and the composed authority of someone who had made a very long drive with a very specific purpose. The October light was flat and clean when Walter came out into the parking lot. He stood beside the GMC for a moment before unlocking it, not from fatigue, but from the particular need to stand still in the open air that sometimes comes over a man when something important has just happened. He set the Winchester across the passenger seat with care. Then he sat behind the wheel without starting the engine and looked at it. He was thinking about his father. Arthur Puit had been a farmer's son from western Kansas who had enlisted at 20, shipped to France in 1918, and arrived in time for the last brutal weeks of the Meuse-Argonne, the largest military operation in American history, a campaign that consumed men at a rate still difficult to fully comprehend. He had come home in 1919. He had been, in all the years Walter knew him, a man of extraordinary reticence about what he had seen over there, not from bitterness, not from shame, from something more considered than either. Arthur had spoken about the war once. Walter had been 26, home on leave between assignments, career behind him, the rest of his life still unformed. He and his father had sat at the kitchen table after dinner, a November wind working at the windows the way it always did in Kansas, persistently, without apology. His mother had gone to bed. The lamp was on. Arthur had poured 2 fingers of whiskey for each of them and sat there for a while without saying anything, and Walter had the soldier's instinct not to fill that silence. Arthur had talked about the shotgun. He had talked about a farmhouse outside a village in the Argonne forest, and a stand of trees, and what the army had understood that most people did not, which was that in close terrain, in the places where rifles were too long and pistols were too small, a pump-action shotgun issued by the United States government was one of the most effective things a man could carry. He talked about the stamp on the receiver, the flaming bomb, the inspector's cartouche, the rack number that meant this specific gun had been inspected, accepted, and assigned to a specific man in a specific unit. He talked about what it meant to carry a piece of government property into a piece of ground and come back out of it. He talked for 45 minutes while the wind worked at the windows and the lamp burned down. He never talked about it again. Walter had never forgotten a single word. He started the truck. The Winchester lay across the passenger seat, corroded, stiff, carrying its history in a language most people no longer knew how to read. And he drove home thinking about 47 years, and a young man squinting into French sunlight, and the patience required to wait that long for something you were not certain you would ever find. He already knew exactly what he was going to do. He had known it before he walked through the door, but first, the workbench. He started Wednesday evening with Croil, a penetrating oil he had trusted for 30 years, applied to the receiver, action housing and magazine tube, then left overnight on a clean cloth. Leaving things alone was one of the most important skills 50 years of gunsmithing had given him. Thursday morning he came back to it. The workbench was 8 feet of oak his father had built in 1934, worn to a smooth grey tan by the kind of use that refinishing would only have insulted. Every tool on the pegboard behind it was exactly where it had been for decades, because in precision work, knowing where your tools are is not a preference. It is a prerequisite. The mechanism had frozen, not broken. Walter had made this distinction a few hundred times and he knew what he was looking at. By late Thursday afternoon the action was cycling, grudging but functional. Thursday evening he turned to the metal. He worked in the direction of the original machining marks, and the rust came away in layers. What was beneath it was the metal itself, intact, not pristine, not restored, but honest. The bore was sound when he checked it by flashlight, which was the thing that mattered. He moved through progressively finer abrasives into the night, and a fine steel wool brought up the original finish in the sheltered areas. He did not try to make it look new. He tried to make it look like what it was. A firearm more than a century old that had been issued by the United States government, had done the work it was issued to do, and had survived. At 9:45 on Friday morning, with the receiver clean enough under the gooseneck magnifier and the lamp on full, he saw it. He had known it was there, but knowing and seeing are 2 different things. The flaming bomb was clear, struck into the metal with a die that had been used to accept ordnance for the United States Army in a war that had ended 106 years ago. Beneath it, in a crisp oval cartouche, an inspector's initials, the handwork of a government ordnance officer whose name Walter did not know, whose face he would never see, who had held this gun in his hands sometime in 1918 and declared it serviceable and ready, and stamped it with the authority of the United States Army, and beneath that, a rack number. Walter sat back on the stool. He set down the magnifier. He placed both hands flat on the workbench surface, the large steady hands of a man who had threaded 1,000 firing pin springs and never once shaken. And those hands were trembling, not from age, from the weight of what he was looking at. He had been a gunsmith long enough to know the ordnance stamps. He had been his father's son long enough to know the unit. And the rack number, small, precise, stamped into metal that had been through a war and a century of storage and 40 minutes on the counter of a pawn shop where nobody had thought to look. The rack number matched what Arthur Puit had described to his son at a kitchen table in 1959, on an evening neither of them had ever directly spoken of again. He stood up from the stool, he went inside, he made a phone call. Raymond Cassidy was 68 years old, a retired professor of military history from the University of Utah, and one of perhaps a dozen people in the country who could identify a Winchester Model 1897 military trench gun from its ordnance stamps alone, without a reference book. He had spent 32 years studying the material culture of the First World War, the objects, the equipment, the documented provenance of things that had passed through the hands of the men who fought it, and published 4 books considered authoritative in specialist circles. In a climate-controlled room of his Salt Lake City home was a collection that represented the better part of his non-mortgage savings. Among the gaps in that collection, the piece he had searched for and written about for 32 years without finding, was a Winchester model 1897 military trench gun with intact government ordnance stamps from the Meuse-Argonne theatre. He also happened to be the grandson of a man named Thomas Cassidy, who had served with the 89th Division in France in the autumn of 1918, the same division as Arthur Puit. Walter had found this connection in 2009, working through a regimental history and a casualty roll. He had written to Raymond with the photograph of his father, the only known photograph of that gun in active service with that unit, and Raymond had responded with a long letter expressing profound gratitude and equally profound doubt that any physical trace of those guns would ever be recoverable after a century. Walter had kept the letter in the same drawer as his father's discharge papers. When the phone rang at Raymond Cassidy's desk at 11 o'clock on a Friday morning, the professor was working on a chapter and answered on the second ring, which was what he always did. "Raymond." The voice was quiet, unhurried. "This is Walter Puit." A pause. Raymond Cassidy did not need to search for context. There are some correspondences that stay current regardless of how long ago they occurred. "Walter," he said, "it's been a while." "Yes," Walter said. "I think I found it." Raymond Cassidy was standing before the sentence was finished. "Tell me," he said. Walter told him. The ordnance flaming bomb, the inspector's cartouche, the rack number clear and legible, matching what Arthur had described, the condition of the bore, the heat shield present and intact, the specific profile of the mounting hardware that distinguished military production from commercial, the bayonet lug. A silence came from Raymond's end that lasted several seconds. "Walter," his voice had changed. The measured scholarly register was still there, but something had gotten underneath it. "I need you to photograph the stamps." "Done. I'm looking at my phone right now." The email address is the same. "I sent them 4 minutes ago." The sound of a chair, quick movement, a keyboard. Then nothing for a long moment, then, "My God," Raymond Cassidy said. He said it quietly. "The way you say something when the word is the only one large enough, and even then it doesn't quite fit." "I know," Walter said. "Where did you find it?" "Pawn shop in town." "Walter, how much did you pay?" Walter told him. Another silence. When Raymond spoke again, it was slowly, as if he was composing something in real time. "I am going to drive to you tomorrow morning," he said. "I want to see this in person." "I'll be in the garage," Walter said. The restoration was finished by noon on Saturday. The action cycled with the smooth authority of a well-made mechanism returned to its specified tolerances. The trigger broke cleanly. The bore was clear from end to end. The metal had the look of a century of honest use. The patina it had earned and nothing more. He set it on a clean cloth on the workbench and stepped back. Whatever his father had carried through the Argonne forest had looked like this. He would never know whether this was the specific gun. That knowledge was 106 years gone. But he knew what was stamped into the receiver, and for the first time in 47 years he was holding something real instead of a photograph. Raymond Cassidy arrived at 1 in the afternoon in a silver Lexus that was dusty from the drive. He was a slight man with a close-trimmed white beard and the bearing of someone who has spent a long career being the most informed person in a room and has stopped needing to make anything of it. He carried a soft-sided case and walked straight from the car to the open garage without stopping or looking around. He went directly to the workbench. He examined the gun for 12 minutes without speaking. He worked through it with a methodical care that Walter recognized and respected. The loop, the calipers, the reference photographs he had brought from his own files, the documentation he made in a small leather notebook with a mechanical pencil. He checked the stamps, the cartouche, the rack number. He matched the profile of the heat shield hardware against a reference photograph. He examined the proof marks on the barrel and confirmed they matched the receiver. Then he stood up straight and looked at Walter. "This is the real thing," he said. "Walter, this is a fully documented, unit provenance confirmed, Meuse-Argonne era, Winchester model 1897 trench gun with continuous chain of government acceptance stamps." He paused. He was not a dramatic man by temperament, but what he said next he said with deliberate weight. "There are 3 known surviving examples of this configuration in the world. 2 are in museums. I have been looking for a gun like this for 32 years. I know, Walter said. I want to make you an offer. Raymond's offer was $12,500, offered seriously and without ceremony, because Raymond Cassidy had spent 32 years thinking about what he would pay for this gun if he ever found it, and he had always known what the answer was. Walter sat with the offer for a moment. He looked at the gun on the workbench the way he had looked at things his entire life, with the full, settled attention of a man who does not rush the things that deserve his time. My father talked about the war once, he said, one time in his whole life. He sat at the kitchen table and talked for 45 minutes about carrying this gun into places where men didn't come back out of. He described the stamp, the cartouche, the rack number. He paused. He never talked about it again. When he died, what he left behind was the photograph and his discharge papers, and a purple heart he wouldn't let us frame. He looked at Raymond. I want it to be somewhere that people can see it, where it means something to someone other than me. Raymond was quiet for a moment. I have a donation agreement in progress with the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, he said. This would be part of that collection. It would be documented, displayed, attributed. Visitors would read about the 89th Division and the Meuse Argonne, and they would see this gun. With the rack number. With everything. Walter looked at the gun for a long time. Then, one condition. Raymond waited. The attribution includes my father's name, Arthur William Puit, and a notation that it was identified and restored by his son. Raymond Cassidy picked up his notebook and his mechanical pencil. Tell me how to spell Pruitt, he said. It was done quickly after that, a handshake, a figure, an exchange of information for the paperwork that would follow. Raymond wrapped the Winchester in padded cloth with the careful reverence one extends to objects that cannot be replaced, and set it in the back of the Lexus with both hands. He closed the hatch softly. He paused before getting into the car. Walter, he said. The listing photograph was terrible. Most people wouldn't have seen anything in it worth driving 40 minutes for. Walter looked at him. I knew the profile, he said. The heat shield, the barrel length, the way the magazine tube sits. I've been looking at that model my whole life. He paused. My father showed me what to look for. Raymond nodded. He got into the car. He drove down the road until the silver Lexus turned out of sight, and Walter went inside and sat in the kitchen for a long time with his hands flat on the table. And the house was quiet around him, and the photograph on the mantelpiece was the same as it had always been, and somehow the quietness of the house was different now from how it had been on Monday, and he was not sure he could have explained why, but he did not feel the need to. Raymond Cassidy did not go directly home. He drove 17 miles to Tanner Street. He had decided on the drive that it needed to be done, not to punish, but because certain truths are owed to people who have missed them. He was a professor by training and by disposition. He parked in the lot of Conklin's Pawn and Resale at 3:40 on Saturday afternoon, and walked in through the door with the leather portfolio and the unhurried stride of a man who knows exactly why he is somewhere. Darren Conklin was behind the counter. A Saturday employee named Carla, who had been working for Darren long enough to read people accurately when they walked through his door, looked at Raymond Cassidy and made her own silent assessment immediately. Darren looked up. Raymond set a business card on the counter. Darren read it. Dr. Raymond Cassidy, Professor Emeritus of Military History, University of Utah. He turned it over. A phone number was written on the back in ink. I want to tell you about a gun that passed through your shop, Raymond said, and I need you to understand what I'm going to say. Darren set the card down. His face had already begun the small rearrangements that precede difficult news. Raymond opened the portfolio. He placed the photographs on the counter in sequence, the receiver stamps, the cartouche with its inspector's initials, the rack number, the heat shield hardware, the full profile of the restored Winchester against the clean cloth on Walter Pruitt's workbench. He laid them out the way a man lays out evidence, not with aggression, but with precision, the way a person who respects facts presents them to a person who has been working without them. Then he explained. He explained what the Winchester Model 1897 military trench gun was, and why it was categorically different from the commercial model it resembled. He explained the ordnance flaming bomb, the inspector's cartouche, and what it confirmed about chain of custody, the rack number, and what could be traced from it, the unit, the theatre, the period of issue, the heat shield, the bayonet lug, the proof marks, the particular combination that made a military issue example distinguishable to someone who knew how to look, from a civilian arm with a similar silhouette. He explained that there were 3 known surviving examples of this configuration in the world. He told Darren what he had paid for this one. The shop was very quiet when he finished. Carla had stopped pretending to do anything else and was listening without apology. Darren stood with both hands flat on the counter and looked at the photographs with the expression of a man who has just been handed accurate information about something he said was certain. "Who was the man?" Darren said. His voice was level. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. "His name is Arthur Puit," Raymond said. "He's 81 years old. He's a Korean War veteran. He spent 31 years as a professional gunsmith. His father was a doughboy who carried this model shotgun through the Mouzargon offensive in the autumn of 1918 and described the ordnance stamps to his son at a kitchen table in 1959. He let that settle. Mr. Puit has been looking for a gun with this unit provenance for 47 years. The shop was silent. "I called it a wall hanger," Darren said. He wasn't asking Raymond to confirm it. He was saying it back to himself because that was the honest thing to do. "Yes." "And I told him it wasn't worth restoring." "Yes." Carla looked at a spot on the floor between them. Nobody said anything for a moment. "Is he—" Darren stopped. Tried again. "Was he upset?" Raymond considered this carefully. "Mr. Puit," he said, "struck me as a man who's been underestimated a considerable number of times in his life and is not measurably damaged by it. He seemed entirely at peace when I left him." He gathered the photographs and closed the portfolio. "But I believed you were owed the accurate information, so you would know what happened here." He moved toward the door, then stopped, without turning around. "The gun is going to the National World War I Museum in Kansas City," he said. "As part of a documented collection, his father's name will be on the placard." A pause. "His son's name will be on it too." The bell rang once over the door. The afternoon light came in and went out. The shop was quiet. Darren stood at the counter for a long time without moving. He was replaying the Tuesday morning exchange, the old man asking to see the shotgun, the careful way Walter had put on his reading glasses and leaned toward the light. He was thinking about the things he had said. "I'm trying to do you a favour here." The assumption embedded in that tone. He had been gentle about it. He had been well-intentioned. But he had looked at a man who carried 60 years of specific, earned knowledge behind his eyes and had seen a cane and an old coat and decided in about 12 seconds what that man knew and was capable of, without asking. Carla, behind him, said nothing. She was thinking her own version of this. Darren found Walter Pruitt's phone number in the transaction record and looked at it for a while. He wasn't certain a call would be welcome, but there was a version of the next 48 hours in which he didn't make it, and that version didn't sit right with him. Darren called on a Friday morning, 2 days after reading the article in the Kansas City paper about the 89th Division, a gunsmith's son, a rusted Winchester, and what it means to hold the object your father could never describe. He had read it twice, his coffee going cold, then set his phone down and looked at the long gun rack behind him, at the space where the Winchester had hung for 4 weeks without anyone knowing what it was. The phone rang 4 times. Walter answered with a brief and unhurried hello. Darren identified himself. There was a short silence. He pressed forward before it could become a long one. "Mr. Puit," he said, "I read the article about your father and the gun. I want to apologise to you in person, if you're willing to allow that. I was wrong about the gun, and I was wrong about more than the gun, and I think you deserve to hear me say so directly." A silence. Not the silence of a man composing a refusal. The silence of a man who has heard an honest sentence and is giving it the space it deserves. "All right," Walter said. They met on a Wednesday at a diner on Route 9 that Walter had been going to since the early 80s. Vinyl booths, laminate countertops, coffee in a thick ceramic mug without asking. Darren drove the 40 minutes out because the effort of the distance had seemed like the right thing to do. Walter was already there, cane hooked over the seat back, reading his phone with the reading glasses on. He looked up and raised a hand in a simple greeting, unhurried, as if they were 2 men who had met here before. They talked for 2 hours. Darren apologised directly, without performance, without asking for more than was warranted. Walter accepted with the same directness. Not excessive graciousness, not prolonged punishment. The quiet acknowledgement of a man who knows the difference between a genuine accounting and a social gesture. Walter talked about his father, the photograph, the kitchen table conversation in 1959, what it had felt like, on a Friday morning with the gooseneck lamp and the magnifier, to finally see with his own eyes what his father had described 65 years before. Darren listened without interrupting. He talked about the curator at the National World War I Museum, who had called the week after Raymond's visit, and confirmed Arthur Puit's name as a documented participant in the specific assault Walter had always known about from that single kitchen table conversation. He talked about the regimental historian who had located Arthur's assignment record from September 1918 and said, in the careful language of someone used to delivering things of weight, that this was the first physical object traceable to that roster entry in over 100 years. Darren, who'd come expecting to feel small, and was accepting of that, left feeling something more complicated, still chastened, but underneath it something unexpected, a kind of enlargement, as if Walter Puit had given him something by simply telling him the truth. He drove home thinking about a box in his mother's basement, his grandfather's things, the grandfather who had served in Vietnam and never talked about it. He had meant to go through that box for years. He went through it that weekend. Carla told her husband about Raymond Cassidy's visit that same evening. Her husband told his father, a veteran. His father called the shop the following week to thank Carla, briefly and indirectly, in a way she understood without needing it explained. Walter Puit continued living in his father's house in Millard County, driving the GMC, working at the bench when something needed his attention. In the spring, he received a formal letter from the National World War I Museum confirming that the Winchester model 1897 trench gun had been accessioned into the permanent collection and would be displayed among personal infantry arms from the Meuse-Argonne campaign. The placard, the letter noted, would read as follows: Winchester Model 1897, Military Trench Gun, United States Army Ordnance Issue, September 1918, carried by Private First Class Arthur William Puit, 89th Infantry Division, American Expeditionary Forces during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Identified, restored, and donated by his son, Walter R. Puit, Korean War veteran, Millard County, 2024. Walter read the letter twice. He set it down on the kitchen table. He looked out the window at the road his father had built. Then he went out to the garage, because there was a Springfield on the bench that needed his attention, and he had given it enough time. The photograph on the mantelpiece was the same as it had always been. The young man in the doughboy's uniform squinting into the French light, one hand on the pistol grip of a shotgun that would outlast him by more than a century. The same photograph. The same frame. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and does not announce itself, not the knowledge that can be summarized in a sentence or confirmed with a credential, the knowledge that builds over 60 years of patient, attentive work, that becomes part of how you move through a room, how you look at a thing that everyone else has looked at and seen only its surface. Walter Puit walked into a pawn shop with a cane and 4 $50 bills, and everything that 6 decades of earned understanding had put behind his pale blue eyes. He did not argue with anyone. He did not try to explain what he saw. He paid a fair price for what he knew, and he carried it out under his arm and he drove home. What was dismissed became documented. What was called junk became history. What was overlooked became permanent, not because Walter demanded it, not because he raised his voice or proved a point, but because he knew what he was looking at and he knew what to do with what he knew. And he did it with the unhurried patience of a man who has nothing to prove and everything to honour. His father carried a gun through the Argonne forest in the autumn of 1918, and came home and never talked about it. His son learned what to look for, and 106 years later, on a Tuesday morning in October, he found it. Don't judge a man by the cane he walks with. Don't judge a gun by the rust it wears. The person standing across from you may be carrying 100 years of knowledge you don't yet have the eyes to read. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We tell these stories every week, the ones about the people who did the work and held the line and carried the history forward without asking to be recognised. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Every story we tell is for someone who walked into a room and was underestimated, and walked out having changed it anyway. This one was for Arthur, and for Walter, and for everyone who has ever been called a wall hanger at best.